How interesting to be following those last two presentations. Because generally speaking, when you're doing a keynote, you don't know the detail of what's coming before you. And it's as if it had all been beautifully planned. Because what we've just heard about is, at that very high level, first of all, some of the dramatic change that's taking place at the moment across society and that's impacting the media industry. And then we heard very eloquently about some of the detailed implications of that high-level change. But what I think we find difficult as an industry is to find the narrative that sits between those two things. That kind of mid-level narrative that helps us all to kind of keep in mind what it is that's going on and what's driving the change that we're experiencing. It's not surprising we find it hard, because it's very, very complex. If you think, of the need to talk about technology change, of consumer change, business-to-business considerations, business-to-consumer, and then we've got the different manifestations of change that happen nationally or regionally or globally, it's hardly surprising that we struggle to find the narrative. But I think if we ask ourselves three very simple but key questions, we can remind ourselves what it is, because there's nothing I'm going to say in the next 20 minutes or so that any of you don't already know. We all know this stuff. It's just about trying to remind ourselves how it joins together. So, what exactly are the drivers for change? What are the implications? What does that mean for our businesses, whether that's content making or content management or content distribution? And how are we going to manage dealing with that change? Now, I'm going to look at these through three pieces of work that have been done by my organization, the DPP, which you may well not all know. So briefly, we are an industry organization that's based in London but operates internationally, and we're the media industry's business change network. So we have well over 300 member companies, and they range from broadcasters, such as Fox and Turner and Disney and the BBC and Al Jazeera, through some of the major global tech players like Apple and Google, Microsoft, some of the key vendors that we have in media, like Avid and Adobe and BizRT, and then through into a whole group of startups and, crucially, well over 100 production companies. Because our organization actually is one for the whole media supply chain. And what that makes possible is for us to have a rounded view of change. We look at it from all sides. So let me begin with giving you the headlines from this piece that we did recently. We were a bit puzzled. Why is it that what we seem to see happening in the consumer realm didn't quite match with what we find ourselves talking about at our trade shows and conferences? And we looked at this through a number of lenses, but particularly we looked at it through three. We went back and we charted the things that everyone was discussing, first of all, at the NAB trade show, sort of the foremost broadcast technology trade show that happens each year in Las Vegas. Then we also looked more broadly at the kind of industry buzz, all the things that people are saying are really exciting and important. And actually, these are the things that the executives from broadcast and content providers call their editorial teams and their technology teams into their offices over to say, do we need a new product line? Do we need to respond and make our content differently? And then we also mapped what was actually happening amongst consumers. It's an interesting picture. First of all, one of the things that strikes you is that when sort of technology talks to technology in a purely business context at NAB, it's oddly disassociated from either what's happening in the consumer realm or actually the broader industry buzz. Just as a little example of that, you know, the talk about ultra-high definition in 2012, very early, actually felt pretty divorced from what actually happened around about 2015, when the major online players, long before the tech standards had been defined around UHD, began to launch ultra-high definition streaming services to the public. But I want you to look particularly at the industry buzz side of this. If you noticed how it's very device-centered, we do like a gizmo, we do like a thing, and also, oddly, in a way that's kind of almost feels self-destructive. Many of these things actually are about changing the very form of content, changing the very form of audio-visual media, suggesting that consumers will want to consume storytelling in a completely different way. And on most of these, perhaps with the exception of drones, I've had people say to me, we will have a whole new kind of storytelling. Yeah? You've probably yourselves been familiar with hearing executives saying things like, we will find kinds of creativity we've never before imagined. And then take a look at what consumers have been doing. Not a lot of what's on the left appears on the right, does it? What this story on the right is this is a story about how much consumers love video. They love video. They love storytelling through sound and vision pretty much in the way we've been doing it for decades, but delivered through new mechanisms. But their love is so powerful, and their access to that content now through connected technologies, and particularly smart devices, has meant that they've been able to create new trends that have completely re-architected our industry. So just think about it. You know, mobile and social video, that was the beginning of the revolution in newsrooms. Binge viewing came from boxed sets. It was a kind of response to Netflix. It changed the way that episodics are commissioned, because now even major series have to be commissioned in large numbers and made extraordinarily fast. And if you've ever listened to the producers of the Game of Thrones, for instance, talk about how they make that series, there's real impacts upon the workflows and the technologies in order to create it fast enough to meet that extraordinary appetite that consumers now have to binge. Streaming video meant broadcasters had to launch OTT services. Vertical video, consumers didn't want to do that, which they should have been doing in the classic laws of photography. They wanted to do that because it was easier. Led lots and lots of companies to have to change their products to cope with it. Non-broadcast video is actually all the straight-to-online content, all the branded content, the corporate content, the many, many manifestations of audio-visual media that we now have beyond what used to be called television. And now we have this phenomenon of live streaming, this extraordinary appetite for live streaming, which has both got great editorial consequences, but also is forcing those companies that supply video over the web to achieve levels of resilience that are getting near to broadcast. So, what's on the left? Many companies and organizations have spent millions and millions of dollars over with very little impact. what's on the right is actually what's been changing our industry. And yet, I would contend we talk about the left more than we talk about the right. Now, the way in which those things have actually changed us makes these numbers rather interesting. If you just look at the combined spend, now this is for North America alone in 2018, okay? These figures are pretty reliable. They do this each year, and they're pretty reliable. So this is North America alone, just this year. Consumers will spend a total, if you do the maths, across streaming services, smartphones, and UHD TVs of $100 billion. $100 billion just getting great streamed storytelling onto their television or onto their smartphone. In comparison, they'll spend about 1% on virtual reality. So I would imagine that when, for instance, Discovery Channel completely re-architect their world, as they have been currently doing, and prepare for the 2020 Olympics, it will be all those things we saw on the previous right-hand list that will be driving them and informing them rather than the left. Okay, so if actually it's more influential than we realize, then is it true that we're in fact starting to get a different kind of supply chain? Well, we think we are. We think that that very familiar kind of broadcast workflow with all its specialist providers for each stage of the process is now beginning to be challenged. So now when you think about how content gets made, you have to think about a moment of procurement, which might be self-procurement. There's so many ways content can come into existence now. It's not about just getting a commission from a TV company. And then you have to create it and create an inventory, because whether you are YouTube or whether you are Disney and maybe Fox, the crucial thing is to have an enormous body of work, because content now doesn't just have a single moment of sharing. It has a life. And then, of course, you have to get it out to consumers. Now, to do this, what we're beginning to do, and this is where the cloud comes in, is we're beginning to build a new kind of supply chain in layers that starts with infrastructure. It has management layers, processing layers, operations layers, tools and services, all of them united by data. But all of it in the service of this, the shift from a supply model to a demand model. It's all built to respond to the urgency of supply to very, very demanding consumers, getting it there as quickly as possible. Now, there's three things about this that I find really interesting. The first is that, I'm not a technologist. I'm a producer by background. So I don't know, but I would put some money that all those layers down there probably could be replicated in many other industries right now. And what that means is that we now have companies playing in the media space who previously played in other spaces. But, this is the second point, the one thing that's very distinctive about applying all of that to media is that moving video files, particularly high definition and ultra high definition ones, around is absolutely horrible. It's a massive technical challenge, and so therefore you need partnerships between those who have that experience of working with audiovisual content and those who are experts in computing. So you can see, for instance, that when Avid and Microsoft form a partnership, it's a completely logical and natural response to the emergence of this kind of supply chain. But the final thing that's so important about this is that if you think of the content maker, the producer up at the top, and the consumer up at the top as well, at the other end of the chain, neither of them care. Neither of them care about this. I mean, right now, as consumers, actually, if we shoot some video We edit it in, maybe on our Apple device or our Android device, and then we share it with our friends. Probably in the back end, there's a lot of this going on. It's invisible to us. So it has to be for those who make content. And because ultimately, they will always be focused on the act of creativity. But there is an impact here. When I first started making films, they were on film, and I actually understood the process, because as a teenager, I'd taken photographs. I'd actually processed film myself. I understood the process and the technology. As time has passed, the distance between the content maker and their knowledge of the process and technology has got wider and wider and wider. But meanwhile, their relationship with the consumer has got closer and closer and closer, to the point where potentially they can supply almost direct. And that intimate relationship is why ultimately they call the shots, and this whole extraordinary complex architecture has to meet the needs of both. And finally, sorry, let's go back one. Okay, we'll stay with that. Finally, we did a piece of work around predictions. Now, we started doing this last year, bringing together expert members from our membership and getting a rounded and very business-focused view of what's currently happening in the media sector and happening to their businesses. When we did it last year, that group said that, quite aside from their specific predictions, they thought there was some general mood music that informed every single thing that they did. And those are the 5 elements of it that they identified. And you can recognize all of those from what I've just been talking about. You can recognize all of them as being driven by those actual consumer behaviors and not driven by any hype-based or dream-led view of what technology might be doing. We revisited this year, just a month or so ago, and we said to them, to a different group, do you think this is the right mood music for 2018 and 2019? They said, yes, but it changes in 2 crucial regards. Security, and we've already heard this morning, interestingly. Security now just becomes part of a bigger phenomenon called trust. Because yes, consumers assume that we're going to look after their data, but we potentially can lose their trust through so many other ways to do with our honesty, our integrity, our values. And then quality of experience. Broadly speaking, the quality of content is getting higher, although there's always that equation of quality and time and cost that may change that, but broadly speaking, quality gets higher. But what's becoming crucial now is that consumers think also about the quality of experience. They want to know that the content that they receive is appropriate to them. So perhaps being provided globally, but feeling appropriate to me personally, and through an interface that I'm going to find very, very simple to use. And this is causing almost every company in the media supply chain, even those who are quite deep within it, to think about consumer engagement. But what do they predict? Well, they made 8 predictions, and I'm not today going to actually go through them all one by one. The smallest one there, which you might have trouble reading, is about versioning, which is all about that notion of there being an inventory of content that has value. But as we go up through these, I want to draw your attention to the ones towards the top. Because what they tell you is that those who are actually engaged in the media industry right now are very, very focused on business reality. Again, look at how hype blind this is. You could almost say it's boring. You might expect, if you're talking about predictions, you're going to find those words like AR, robotics, VR, nowhere. Where you find AI, actually, expressed through machine learning, is around automation. But automation to do what? Automation to do some very basic but crucial tasks in the production chain around things like compliance, quality control. Has to happen because now, actually, you have to take out some cost, because actually, broadcasting is no longer in the control of the broadcasters. You have to do so much so quickly, you have to be focused on having a very efficient supply chain. That sense of losing control is expressed through the second prediction. And I should have said, by the way, with the gal from the right, that our people gave these impact scores, which give us this kind of weighting of significance. That actually nobody knows how the economics of our industry work anymore. We all did, but now we don't. We had CDNs, content delivery network companies, saying to us in this session, you know, if a lot of the OTT providers succeeded in getting their customers to consume the amount of content they'd like them to consume in the quality that they promised to them, they'd A, take down the internet, and B, probably make themselves bankrupt, because the OTT provider would not be able to afford the distribution costs that would come with such consumption. So we actually don't even really know how economics of our industry work any longer, and that is likely to produce some big changes and some big fails. And of course, right at the top, data, absolutely paramount if you're going to meet all those new music themes and if you're going to understand your own business. So, I talked about this sort of connecting narrative. What is it? I think at heart, what it is that at a time of so much change and so much potential, we get so focused on what could be and what could happen that actually we're in danger of spotting, of failing to spot that actually trends that are happening right in front of us that in some ways seem quite mundane, simply as simple as more people consuming more types of media more easily. As simple as that. That is what's actually driving 95% of the change that's happening in our industry. And so it makes me conclude the following. First, at a time of such instability, we all have to be very, very focused on what our value proposition is, because we can't afford to be doing the things that we're not supremely good at. Personally, I suspect that will lead some content makers and providers to make some very bold decisions about their role, for instance, in technology. Are they any longer the best placed companies to be doing technology innovation and architecting, when actually what they're really, really good at is editorial? The only way to stay competitive will be to work out who you should be competing with and who you should be working with. Nobody can supply to all this complexity on their own. We will see some very interesting partnerships happening in the next few years in our supply chain. Some of them will probably prove to be game-changing. Third, it's getting impossible to talk about media as a single homogeneous thing. You know, even the notion of genres, which is a very television idea, is breaking down. You've actually got all these different kinds of specialism around media. And remember, media goes right out into, you know, maintenance drones that are filming electricity pylons. It is such a broad canvas from there to a broadcast sports event, the Super Bowl, that's such a broad canvas that we're going to have to start thinking about discrete markets along that chain. But the fourth and most important of all is never, ever, ever underestimate the power of a really great idea from a creative person that is supplied to consumers who love that idea to change everything we're doing, once again, almost overnight. Thank you very much.